good friends from the MSA and from other parts of the university, the Intercultural Center, I welcome you to the fourth talk in the Spirit Acting Multifaith Views on Social Change and Social Action speaker series. We're so pleased you're here, and as you notice, we have some food outside, so if you get thirsty or hungry, please get up and get something. I'm Nancy Sokup, and I just want to say a quick word about our sponsors. This particular series was the brainchild of the Interfaith Council, which is a consortium of students, leaders, and faith groups on campus, including Hillel, InterVarsity, the Muslim Students Association, and the Newman Club. And we've had wonderful talks so far. But most important, we are so grateful to our sponsors and co-sponsors. This is part of a mini grant from the President's Inclusive Excellence Initiative, the College of Arts and Sciences, the FCAS Division of Humanities and Performing Arts, the School of Law, and the Feinstein Center for Service Learning and Community Engagement. Here is my public service announcement. Some of you may want to do this, sign up for the merit point system. I have the keyboard at the end of the talk. Just come and get it from me and sign up. So that is public service announcement. I am very pleased to introduce Rowan, who is the Vice President of MSA, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rowan Khanstein. I'm a sophomore here at Roger Williams University, and I'm also the Vice President of the Muslim Student Association, like Reverend Nancy said. Today we have here a very special speaker, all the way from Brown University, who is the Associate University Chaplain for the Muslim community at Brown University. Before Brown, he was the Muslim advisor at Dartmouth College from 2008 to 2009, and an adjunct instructor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York. In 2008, he graduated from Princeton with a master's in religion, where his studies focused on the interpretation and practices of Islam in the 21st century in America. In 2001, he received a bachelor's from Brown with honors in religious studies for a thesis entitled Muslim Perceptions of Hinduism. In addition to his work and studies within higher education, he has been involved with various American Muslim institutes. He has taught courses and lectured for the Muslim Public Service Network, the Mecca Center, and various learning institutes for Muslims, the Institute of Islamic Education, Qasid Institute, Nawawi Foundation, and the Islamic American University. He has also worked with various Muslim summer camps, such as the Muslim Youth Camp, and has been in existence for half a century now, the camp. Lastly, he has published articles in Islamic Horizons, Balloon Magazine, and now defunct Islamica. Most importantly, he is married to Sumaya Belbel, a fellow Brown grad, who is also a Harvard MBA, and enjoys watching pro football and listening to heavy metal music when he has the time. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute honor to have here with us today a true inspiration, Robert David Coolidge.
Can everyone hear me okay? Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you. That's the first time that anyone's called me a true inspiration. So hopefully I don't disappoint. I'm going to begin with a customary way in which I would normally begin, with an Arabic invocation. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulihil Kareem. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. In the name of God, the source of compassion and mercy, all praise is due to God, the Lord of the worlds, and may blessings and peace be upon his noble messenger and upon his family and his companions altogether. Ameen. Amen. So I entitled my talk, Seeking the Good, a Rhode Island Muslim Story. And the reason I chose that particular title is I'll break it down word by word. So seeking, as it's a project that's always unfinished. You know, my job and my volunteer work and the things that Rowan mentioned is essentially the story of my life and what I'm trying to do with my life, but it's always a project unfinished. And I often call, you know, Islam my sort of theory of existence. You know, I'm in this world and I have to act in this world and I have to seek the good. I have to seek the good in terms of truth, in terms of right and wrong, in terms of justice. And Islam is the sort of paradigm or the theory, the framework in which I try to do that. And in that respect, one of my favorite prayers is the prayer from the Quran, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً. Our Lord, give us good in this world and give us good in the next world as well. And that for me is a modeling of, you know, the inseparability for religious people of seeking the social good in this world with the theological good of the next world. The good that comes from a relationship with God and the seeking of salvation is intimately tied with the good of seeking a good life in this world for oneself, for one's family, for one's friends, for one's community, for one's colleagues, and even for people that one does not know. And then I said it's a Rhode Island Muslim story because I wanted to ground it in the reality in which I've been living my life over the last 3 years, which is as the Muslim chaplain at Brown University, and also for the last 2 years I've been the president of the Rhode Island Council for Muslim Advancement, which is the umbrella group for Muslims in Rhode Island, and I'll speak a little bit more about that as I move forward. So that's the context, and then it's a Muslim story, because although my name is David Coolidge and outwardly I don't necessarily seem like I would be a Muslim if you saw me walking down the street, although you might think, why does that guy have that funky chin beard? He seems a little too old to have that sort of college facial hair, you know. But that's something that I wear for matters of faith. But you know, otherwise you wouldn't know that I was Muslim per se, unless you happen to catch me praying on the ground in some random location. Then you just might think I was weird. Why is that guy, you know, bowing onto the grass? So that's a sort of framework in which I'm coming at this, and in order to sort of expound on that a little bit more, I need to explain a little bit about how I became a Muslim and how my faith grew after I became a Muslim. You know, so this is my second time in Rhode Island, because from 1998 to 2001 I was an undergraduate at Brown University. And it's funny, as I was reflecting upon this talk and this series, which I'm honored to be a part of, and which I thank you very much for honoring me and inviting me to be with people that are probably far better than myself, who have preceded me in speaking about these things. I remembered that it's actually interfaith service that came before Islam, because when I was a freshman at Brown, I was part of something called the Interfaith Service Organization, which was an attempt to discover our religious principles or our religious ideals, or engage with people of different faiths through doing community service projects together that weren't specifically religious in nature, but that was a framework for us to come together. And I at the time would have, essentially considered myself an agnostic, but there were other people in the group that were Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, and some Christians, and it was an experience that was very defining for me, but at the same time was not fully what I was looking for, because my interest in religion on the one hand was something that was purely intellectual. I was a religious studies major, and I knew I wanted to be a religious studies major coming into Brown, because I just found religion to be one of the most fascinating subjects in the world. Just the way that some people think that economics is a fascinating subject, or Chinese history is a fascinating subject, or chemistry is a fascinating subject. For me, religion was like that. And at the same time, by studying religion all the time, I was always asking myself, well, what do I think about the world? What do I think about existence? And to make a long story short, in the marketplace of ideas, Islam was the story about existence that won out. It was the framework that made the most sense to me about why we're here, why we exist, what the purpose of life on earth is all about. But it was something that I came to gradually with a lot of, kind of critical thought behind it. And so even when I became Muslim, although I sort of crossed a threshold where I truly believed in the basic theological tenets of Islam, which are encapsulated in the phrase, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. That although I believed in those fundamental theological principles, I still had a lot of questions. Still a lot of questions about the Islamic tradition, about my place within the Muslim community, about what being a Muslim would entail in terms of how I lived my life. And so when I sort of reached that point of faith, which was centered around the life story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also the Quran as a text of revelation, that although those were the things that encapsulated my faith as a Muslim, and I would say to this day remain the central elements of my faith, it didn't really give me all the answers, so to speak, about how I was going to figure out how to be a white Muslim guy from Chicago, Illinois, in the Ivy League in 1998. And then obviously, the answers that I crafted over the next 3 years, even though they were sincere and authentic in their own way, they weren't prepared to help me deal with 9/11. And so there was a whole experience of being Muslim that came after having entered the faith that was essentially, on the one hand, an intellectual experience, and on the other hand, a social experience. There's a big debate in the Islamic tradition between different scholars about whether or not human beings can know the good and the ugly, or the good and the evil, purely by reason, or if they need the text of revelation to let them know. And then there's a sort of corresponding sociological debate about whether or not human beings can sort of spontaneously from within themselves manifest the good into society through something innate, what, for example, they would call in the Islamic tradition the fitra, the innate, pure, good human nature, or whether or not it has to sort of be imposed from the outside by some authority, whether a prophet or a text of revelation. And although there's a debate in the tradition, at the same time, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Every human being is both embedded within a social reality, but also concerned about, some sort of metaphysical reality, some sort of truths beyond this world that a revelation, whether it be, the Bible or the Torah or the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran, is supposed to speak about, And so for myself, this tension of trying to figure out this dialectic between my sort of social world and my theological world was difficult, but at the same time a very creative tension. Because one of the things that it led me to realize was that there was a lot of good that I was taught growing up that I was not even aware of until I had a theological framework from which to understand it. Because I was raised a Christian, but not a particularly theological Christian. I often describe the church that I grew up in as, Jesus was a good guy, so you should be one too. Perhaps the social gospel, as they say. And so for myself, in a way, I had been inculcated, through those Judeo-Christian values, or even through American secular values of democracy and fairness and equality and things like that, to have a conception of the good. But at the same time, it wasn't my full picture, because there was this missing piece, which was about the big picture about life and existence and meaning and death and all of that. And so part of my journey as a Muslim was to learn to discover the ways in which those good, came together, if you will. That, oftentimes they were presented to me by both Muslims and non-Muslims as two separate streams. east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, so to speak. As Rudyard Kipling said. But that my own life, my own existence on this earth was a constant challenge to that framework. I have friends, for example, that when they became Muslim in California, left the country for a decade and lived in Yemen, lived in Mauritania, which is a country in West Africa, lived in other parts of the Muslim world, and then realized after 10 years of being away that, hey, they're Americans, and they have, a sort of responsibility to their country, to their family, and that, they could never erase their Americanness. And I never got the opportunity, actually. I wanted to go to Syria to study after graduation from Brown, but my parents forbade me. And, obedience to one's parents, in something that is non-obligatory in the religion, right? So studying the religion is not obligatory beyond a certain very basic prerequisites. So that's not obligatory, but obeying my parents is. So they said, no, you can't go to Syria. So I said, okay, well, if I'm really serious about being a Muslim and not just having an adventure in Syria, I have to listen to my parents and stay here. So I never got the opportunity to travel the way some of my friends did. But in the end, as a Muslim is supposed to sort of always remember, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no power and there's no might except with God. That although at the time it seemed like a difficult choice to make that was keeping me from fully embracing, an authentic Islamic faith, that in actuality it was the way in which God would teach me to take my social reality very seriously. So my life is an interfaith life. Interfaith work is what I do every day. It's what I've done every day since the minute I became Muslim, because I'm the only Muslim in my family. A couple of my friends, from prior to when I became Muslim after me, and some a little bit before me as well. But otherwise, most of my friends from growing up are not Muslim. That reality, living in that social reality, forces one, to discover a way of being that is not bifurcated. They talk about bifurcated consciousness. That you're one way in this setting and you're one way in another setting. So I mean, with all due respect to our brothers and sisters from Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is the king of the bifurcated consciousness. People in Saudi Arabia behave very differently than people outside of Saudi Arabia, Saudis themselves. And it's also funny because when Muslims go to visit Saudi Arabia, they behave differently when they're in Saudi Arabia, and they put on a certain act, when they're in. Hopefully with good intentions, so that when they're in Mecca and Medina, they get the blessings of those places. But this is a reality because we live in this dualistic world where oftentimes, tradition is, put next to modernity, or East is put next to West, and somehow these things are irreconcilable. But as I said, my own life is one where I've had to reconcile them. So one way in which I did it intellectually, for example, was through learning about how the traditions of interpretation of the Constitution of the United States of America are very, very similar to the traditions of interpretation of the Quran as enshrined in a classical discipline called usul al-fiqh, the philosophical bases of jurisprudence. So Islamic law is a very important thing to Muslims. It defines how they pray, how they dress, how they eat, many other things. And this is the philosophical basis for any, sort of understanding of Islamic law, usul al-fiqh. So it's fascinating. And there's a scholar, for example, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Law who is a specialist on this and wrote her SJD thesis at Harvard on this very question. And it's a fascinating read. And so, through finding these intellectual similarities, it was a way in which I could begin to, bridge this divide. But at the same time, then there's the question of like the social good that is real and that is palpable, right? And for myself and for many Muslims prior to 9/11, there was definitely a sort of bifurcated consciousness that like, okay, well, you sort of focus your efforts on the good of the Muslims, right? So there was a constant concern about the Muslims in Kashmir, or the Muslims in Palestine, or the Muslims in Bosnia, during the Bosnian War, or Muslims in Chechnya, in the war between Chechnya and the Soviet Union, or actually by that time it was Russia. This was part of the sort of zeitgeist of the pre-9/11 world, and for American Muslims as well. But what 9/11 did is it, basically woke up and made every Muslim in America sort of realize that they're in America, they have a particular reality to deal with, that if they don't deal with it, then one, it's not going to be good for them as a community, but more importantly, that it's not going to actually fulfill their responsibilities as Muslims to be good neighbors, to be productive members of society, and to not always be thinking about what's going on the other side of the ocean. And so after 9/11, a whole new discourse began, which really focused on Islam in America as a form of being Muslim that took the context very seriously. Whether that had to do with political engagement, and so Muslims sort of got out of the mosques and got into discussions with policymakers and elected officials, and then also brought those policymakers and elected officials into the mosques to help them understand what the American Muslim community was about. Whether it was in form on the sort of economic, social justice-based issues, right? So although this organization existed before 9/11, after 9/11 it took off in new directions. It's called the Inner City Muslim Action Network in the southwest side of Chicago, which is, for example, runs a free clinic where it's Muslim run, but anybody who comes is given, health services, and there's no, missionary work that's tied to it in any way, shape, or form. It's just out of the belief that Muslims have a responsibility to care for their neighbors and to provide for the well-being of their neighbors, whether they be Jew, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, or whatever. And so, that became a model that was very, very inspiring to someone like myself, who was from Chicago. And I've, sort of been a supporter of it however I can over the years, although since I haven't lived in Chicago much, I haven't been able to do a lot of work on the ground. And then there were other, things such as, creating, for example, what's called people often call it sort of authentic American Muslim discourse in terms of intellectual matters. So how do we understand Islam as Americans? So there, for example, there was a scholar named Omar Farouk Abdullah, also from Chicago, who wrote a series of articles sort of rethinking Islam from the sources, from the Quran, from the hadith of the Prophet, the collected sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, from the traditions of the Muslim scholars, and trying to think through the question of how one could be authentically Muslim in America and have a healthy framework that's not bifurcated. It's a unified vision of how I'm going to worship God and engage in society. And this is a process that's still ongoing. So I brought all of that with me when I came to Rhode Island, and some of the things that that has led me to focus on in my time here is, one, is recognizing the absolute essential nature of interfaith work, right? And in that respect, I give most credit to my boss, Janet Cooper Nelson, who, if she had not had the vision, would not have created a multi-faith team at Brown University to deal with these issues, which is, as far as a team of religious professionals goes, is unique in Rhode Island. And it's even unique compared to many of its peer institutions. To have specifically a Catholic, a Jew, and a Muslim, and a Protestant all on the same staff, all fully engaged with one another, all concerned about the larger life of the university. So that became one way of thinking about that shared good, is that although of course my responsibility is first and foremost to the Muslims at Brown, I wish well for all members of the Brown community and hope to contribute in whatever way I can to whoever happens to come through my door as a chaplain. I mean, my expertise is in Islam and Muslim societies and Arabic and things like that, so I can't help them if they want to read something in Hebrew. They'll have to go to the rabbi to study something in Hebrew. But otherwise, I hope to find ways in which I can help people. And there are many For example, students that come to talk to all of the different chaplains about just what's going on in their life. You know, needing a sort of shoulder to cry on, or needing an interlocutor to think through a difficult issue in their life. You know, that is something that's very difficult to do because we don't always share the same framework of thinking about the world, but at the same time, it's absolutely essential. Because it's only through sharing with one another our most intimate thoughts and hopes and dreams that we begin to understand and truly respect each other's vision for the good life. In addition to Janet Cooper Nelson at Brown, I would also recognize Don Anderson from the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, who, for example, went out of his way to create a press conference when there was this talk of Quran burnings a couple years ago in the media, to say just basically, you know, I want to have nothing to do with that as a Christian. And I want to sort of make this an opportunity to say that Rhode Island is a state founded upon religious toleration, and so Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, everyone is welcome here to find that fullest expression of their faith. And so I was, you know, honored to stand beside him at the press conference and recognize that people like him, you know, make me realize that I've got a lot more work to do. I mean, they set the bar very, very high. That's one of the difficult parts about being a religious professional is you go and you see a rabbi who's working 10 times as hard as you, and you sort of like, well, you know, even if I think my religion's right, I mean, this guy's outdoing me, you know, by 1,000%. And it's, you know, you sort of see the people that walk the walk, right? And it makes you feel like perhaps you're just talking the talk too often. And then I've been involved with a number of different things that, you know, for me as a Muslim, I was involved in because these were addressing issues that were of deep concern to me. So, for example, I went to Rabbi Alan Flam at Brown University when I first got here and said, listen, I noticed that there's a big homeless issue in Rhode Island. How can I make some small contribution? He was like, you should, you know, give some money to Providence In-Town Churches Association, which is a nonprofit that was spun off of a project that was put together by the main Protestant churches in downtown downtown Providence. They had created a food pantry, I think, initially, and then expanded into different social services, and then spun it out into its own nonprofit. And then they ended up asking me to be on their board for a year, which was an amazing experience, to be honest, because not only was it my first time being on a social services nonprofit board, and I learned a lot, but it was also, you know, an amazing opportunity for me to understand, you know, the seeking of the good from the perspective of a predominantly Protestant Christian framework, and recognize that basically, like, as far as the social services go that we're supporting, whether it's through volunteer work or donations or other forms, there's no difference. I'm a Muslim, you're a Christian, it's irrelevant to our conception of this social good. You know, PICA runs I think currently runs the most frequented food pantry in the state of Rhode Island. And, you know, it's often not credited as a religious organization, but it is. But it doesn't want to be, because it doesn't want people to think, well, we're doing it for some sort of nefarious reasons, like, you know, to try and get people to be this or that, but simply out of love for humanity. And so I was thinking about these types of things, and I was thinking about verses from the Quran and statements of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that reflect what I'm trying to say. And so in this respect, I will invoke what's the Muslim form of the Golden Rule, which is a statement that's attributed to the Prophet when he said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believes, or none of you has reached the perfection of faith until you love for your brother, or until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And one of the famous commentators on these statements, Imam al-Nawawi, who died in the 13th century in Damascus, rahimahullah, may God have mercy on him, he said that the brotherhood that's mentioned in this particular hadith, this particular saying, is the brotherhood of all humanity. That this is a pre-modern source, you know, saying that this is about loving all of humanity. And what's actually funny is that in modern Muslim discourse, this often gets framed as just being concerned with your Muslim brother. but that goes against Imam Nawawi's interpretation. So I'll stick with Imam Nawawi's interpretation since I love him a lot. And then a verse of Quran that I thought spoke to this was أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واتبعوا الأحسن ما أنزل إليكم من ربكم. Follow the best of what has been revealed to you from your Lord, right? And so for me, like, that's encapsulated in the Quran, and that's encapsulated in the statements of the Prophet Muhammad, what Muslims often refer to as the Quran and the Sunnah. But what's amazing about it is that in the process of living in this world, I realized that my best is often other people's best as well. You know, the height of generosity, the height of selflessness, that I look to and I see exemplified in the Muslim tradition, I also see shining and sterling examples of that from outside of my tradition, and seek to draw close to that out of a sense that that is something that is uplifting, that is the excellence that I seek as a Muslim. So there's many different organizations I could mention. There's also, for example, IWA, the American Islamic Wellness Association, which is a more recent nonprofit, which was started by Wissam Ahmed, who's an Egyptian immigrant, and his wife Gina, who just recently got her PhD from Brown. And they're both healthcare professionals. And this is a sort of Muslim-run attempt to support an already existing free clinic, which is called Clinica Esperanza Hope Clinic in Olneyville, which is, again, a sort of culturally sensitive, free health clinic concerned about those in Rhode Island who don't have any insurance. And so basically they saw that this clinic had a need, that the Muslim doctors in Rhode Island, there are many Muslim doctors in Rhode Island, they could help fulfill that need. And so they put together this organization to assist that to assist Hope Clinic. And they run, for example, every Saturday their own clinic, and they call it the Amal Clinic, which is, Amal is hope in Arabic. So Clinica Esperanza in Spanish, Hope Clinic in English, Amal Clinic in Arabic. And then, there's so many other good initiatives in the state of Rhode Island, and in fact, I think one of my challenges is wanting to be of support to all of them, but knowing that I have my own limits of being able to contribute. I have my own, as they often call it, compassion fatigue or something like that. And this is something that I think clergy, although I'm not technically clergy, I sort of function, I play one in real life. This is something that's very difficult. There's so many things that are happening in Rhode Island that have so much need for volunteer hours, for donations, for more sophisticated, management techniques, or maybe even not sophisticated management techniques, but just some sort of oversight in management and administration. There's not enough people in Rhode Island to do it. This is one of the unique things about Rhode Island, is that there's so much we can do because we have such a small scale to deal with in terms of being 1.2 million people crammed into a small space with all of the bureaucracy and structure of any given state in the union. But that means that we only have so many people to go around to do all the worthy work that needs to be done. So I think for myself, I've been focused on supporting those who already have initiatives, right? So when I see something like PICA, the Providence In-Town Churches Association, or I see something like the Iowa American Islamic Wellness Association or the Hope Clinic, I feel that, what's the purpose in me going and creating my own sort of thing? I should be following the best, That's what it says. It says, وَاتَّبِعُوا أَحْسَنَ. Follow the best, right? So if someone else is doing a better job than I could ever do, and someone else is exemplifying that social good, then it should be upon me as a good follower. In Islam, you're supposed to want to be a follower, not a leader. So I'm happy to be a follower of leaders that are far better than myself. And then what does that mean, just to sort of sum up, how does that relate to the Muslim community in general in Rhode Island? The Muslim community in Rhode Island is small, but at the same time it's grown exponentially. When I was an undergrad, there was a couple mosques with, a couple hundred attendees. Now there's 6 mosques, each with, if not, dozens and dozens of attendees, then hundreds and hundreds of attendees. We have 3 vibrant MSAs, Roger Williams, URI, and Brown's MSA. We have, the Iowa group, which is the sort of first, really functioning, well-functioning Muslim nonprofit specifically on social services. Our organization, RICMA, has something called the Healthy Families Initiative, which is an anti-domestic violence organization focused on the Muslim community and run by some of our very dynamic female Muslim leaders in Rhode Island. There's more to do, and there's more that's coming, and there's more that needs to be done. But just like in Rhode Island in general, the Muslim community suffers from lack of volunteer time, lack of capital, lack of connections between different communities, right? One of the unique aspects of being a Muslim in America is we have one of the most diverse, actually we have the most diverse Muslim communities in the entire world, except perhaps in the cities of Mecca and Medina and Saudi Arabia, where people come from all over the world and stay if they can figure out how to stay. For example, in Rhode Island we have significant Egyptian communities, Syrian communities, Nigerian communities, Gambian communities, African American Muslim communities, a smattering of white and Latino converts, Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladeshis, and so on and so forth, Moroccans. And so everyone is coming from their own cultural framework, and then they're sort of thrust into the Rhode Island scene and trying to make sense out of Rhode Island as a state and as a state with a long history and lots of traditions, but also this sort of melting pot of Muslims. And I've been in meetings, for example, with Muslim leaders in Rhode Island where it's very clear that everybody is thinking in their own language first, then trying to articulate it in English, and then sometimes talking past each other. Because, this person's thinking in French, and this person's thinking in Arabic, and this person's thinking in Urdu. They're trying to convey it into English, then the other person's hearing it and maybe not fully understanding, but they're passionate about the issues. So I really think that what has been of the greatest benefit to Muslims in Rhode Island, both vis-a-vis their relations with themselves and with relations outside of the Muslim community, has been just simple conversations, meetings, gatherings, opportunities for outreach with each other and with non-Muslims. I went to one event that was put together. It was essentially a learning group for elderly folk, and sort of self-directed study, and they had put together a sort of curriculum bringing together a number of religious leaders in Rhode Island and community leaders within religious communities. And when I came to talk to them, they said, we had the hardest time reaching out to the Muslim community, and we are so glad that you're here, because otherwise, if you hadn't responded to our requests, then we feel like we wouldn't have ever gotten the chance to meet a Muslim and know what's going on with the Muslim community in Rhode Island. And they said, why is that? And I said, well, there's a number of reasons why it is, but if you look at the Polish community or you look at the Irish community in America 100 years ago, that they also had a tendency, to keep to themselves, right? And they were not expected to always be, answering for themselves in the court of public opinion, right? They had 100 years to go from, fresh immigrants to finding their place within the American mosaic, right? And in that process being able to decide for themselves the ways in which that their community was going to adapt to this new American reality. But the Muslims are on the hot spot right now. And people don't realize that maybe this guy didn't come until 5 years ago, and his English isn't fully grasped yet. His sense of how the political system works isn't grasped yet. His sense of how the media works hasn't coalesced in his own mind. And yet he's being asked to represent the faith and represent the Muslims overseas, and asked to sort of quell the fears of the American public that please just sort of, I've been in so many conversations where the backdrop is like, we're assuming you're a good guy, but we also want to kind of confirm that you're truly a good guy and you're not out to harm us. And so I've often had to be, the one to stand up and to be very just vocal about all these issues, out of the recognition that it's my responsibility as someone who, grew up in America and understands all of those things, and is simply trying to, bring benefit to the Muslim community and to the wider Rhode Island community, because I think that it's a mutually sort of symbiotic relationship. You know, that Rhode Island is a better place because that Muslims are here and that they feel comfortable and that they can find ways to contribute through creating organizations like Iowa. You know, that they can be part of the educational systems, they can be part of the economic life of the city and the state in ways that feel authentic, to them, that feel that they're not being forced to assimilate too rapidly, that they're not being sort of having to become, sort of American at the threat of, being thrown into some sort of confinement, because it's a real fear amongst a lot of Muslims, especially people who have come more recently. And so, for example, this Saturday we're putting together a panel at the biggest mosque in Rhode Island, Masjid al-Karim, the Islamic Center of Rhode Island, which is just south of Classical High School in downtown Providence, that is bringing, for example, a professor from the law school here, bringing the head of the Rhode Island ACLU, and bringing a number of representatives from federal agencies to basically, have a whole panel that will explain, how Muslims can protect their civil rights in America, and provide them access to professionals in those fields that they might not otherwise have access to. And so those are kind of things that are kind of no-brainers, right? You have to get people, connected with the resources that they need. But at the same time, even though we have a very small geographic distance to travel to know one another, as any Rhode Islander knows, the geographic distance, is not representative of the sentiment of distance that people feel between each other. So I think what all this relates to is, whether it's the Muslim community, whether it's the Jewish community, whether it's the Catholic community, whether it's people who don't identify with any religion, is that Rhode Island provides a unique opportunity for people to come together across faith lines and across cultural lines to really feel a true sense of solidarity in creating, the common good and in seeking the common good. And opportunities like this are great opportunities to reflect upon that process, but at the same time, when we recognize that we're talking the talk, that means that we also have to sort of stop and check ourselves and recognize that means that now we have to walk the walk. And I hope that, I'm able to walk the walk more, and I hope that this has provided you with some, beneficial pieces of reflection upon your own involvement in this grand narrative that is the state of Rhode Island, which is the framework, the context in which we are all seeking the good, even if we only feel like we're here for a short time. The reality is, and this is what our theological traditions teach us, is that we're all strangers and we're all travelers on the road. We're all only here for a short time. So we hope that when we reflect on these things, they give us the inspiration and the passion to try a little bit harder to make each day that we've had here worth it, and each relationship that we've built with other people worth it, and each good that we've sought was the best, that we followed the best of what we had available to us, that was within our reach, and God willing, inshallah, we will be able to grasp it. So, thank you very much.
Blessing.
Ask questions?
Oh, yes. Do we have any questions? I know I have a couple, but any questions? Dave.
Or comments.
Or comments, right?
That's good.
I have one question,
Yeah.
and that, or a comment, and I really appreciate you talking about how students in particular, Muslims in Rhode Island often find themselves, as you put it, bifurcating culturally. And I know that was one thing that we've talked about quite a bit since I've known you, is that you came to do this chaplaincy work to help Muslim students be able to integrate the practice of their faith with their daily life. Are you seeing that shift, change better? I know when you were at Brown, it was very difficult to do that. There were really separations. But what have you observed with students over the past few years that you've been at Brown?
Well, not just at Brown, but at Dartmouth, and then in other schools in terms of my colleagues that are different schools. I think that there's, you know, sort of emerging sense of a unified self in pursuit of that good, and people recognizing that, you know, there truly is, you know, just one world, you know, or as one scholar says, one world system. And that, you know, there's no retreat into some sort of cultural authenticity, you know, that is possible without some level of engagement with the world as it is, politically, economically, intellectually. And you know, I think that there was a certain fantasy of that, you know, was created. I mean, scholars would debate this, but I think, you know, was created in a very palpable way for the second half of the 20th century. And I think within the last 10 years, you've seen the erosion of that way of thinking. And, you know, essentially the marginalization, the sort of eruption and then subsequent marginalization of discourses like Al-Qaeda, which are, you know, in and of themselves meant to exist only with a bifurcated world. You know, that we are the Muslims and we are, you know, the holders of truth and right and goodness, and you are the non-Muslims and you are all wrong and all bad, which is reflected in their political theology, which divides the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Kufr, the abode of Islam, the abode of righteousness and where Muslims live, and then the abode of disbelief. That was their political theology. That, I mean, Muslims en masse have rejected that. You know, whether they're in Pakistan, whether they're in Egypt, whether they're in Indonesia. And that discourse is increasingly marginalized in the Muslim world, and it's also had a ripple effect into Muslim communities in the West, because, as I said before, after 9/11, they sort of created of a unified consciousness that sort of had to say, listen, like there's no place for us to go make hijra to, right? This is a word in the Islamic lexicon, to emigrate, to go somewhere where you'll be safe. There is no place that you're safe, so you have to engage where you are, you know? And I think that the Muslims that are in, you know, the institutions of higher education now recognize that, and they study, you know, politics because they want to engage with the political nature of the world. They study economics because they want to engage with the capitalist system. They study, you know, art and science and everything in between, because they recognize that whether they, you know, grew up in Saudi Arabia or whether they grew up in Chicago, Illinois, that it's one world and that we're all connected in one way, shape, or form. And so, you know, empowerment in one, you know, field, empowerment in one place means upliftment, you know, across the board. And so I think that, you know, it's a very exciting time to be sort of involved with young Muslims. And to be part of that conversation, but it's also very scary, right? Because, you know, I'm not a sheikh, I'm not a Muslim religious leader, you know, I'm not a clergy member. You know, there's plenty of people that know a lot more about the Quran and a lot more about the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You know, but my students look at me like I'm a sheikh or something like that, and they ask me questions about all sorts of things. And if I don't know the answer, I say I don't know, because in the Islamic tradition they say la adri nisful ilm. Saying I don't know is half of knowledge. So I have to be able to say I don't know, or else I'll just, you know, be proving my own ignorance. But at the same time, the types of questions that people ask me, I mean, it's just, sometimes they just ask me 3 questions in one day and I go home like spiritually exhausted, because it's sort of like I'm having to hold the tensions of these different worldviews, these different cultural complexes in my head and in my heart, and then try and provide an answer that, although I have a justifiable reason to argue why this is what I think is the right answer, but this is a way of thinking about it, or these are some things to read. At the same time, you know, I don't really know, right? We say in the Islamic tradition, Wallahu a'lam, God knows best, right? Like, I'm just trying my best to figure these things out. That's why I call it seeking the good, right? Because, like, if I turn out to realize that my conception of the good is wrong, I'm going to have to change course and be honest about that. And that's a very humbling experience. And so even though I have a very small sphere of authority at Brown University in Rhode Island, like, you know, it's an incredibly weighty thing. And people have asked me to do other things. I say, listen, I don't want to have any more authority and voice in anything right now, because even what I do now is incredibly taxing on my soul, because I'll be asked, in the Islamic conception, I'll be asked about anything that I, may have said or done, and it's a very scary thing. So, but my kids seem to like me. My students seem to like me. So hopefully their good approval is, they say, I actually got to find this saying. I can't remember exactly where it's from. It might be a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's essentially about that if the congregation is well pleased with their leader, then that's a sign of God's good pleasure with them. Whereas if they really don't like him, they're like, I gotta get him out of here as quickly as possible, then maybe you should sort of think about how you're doing things and check yourself. So
that sounds like congregationalism.
Oh yeah. Well, Islam, we never had a sort of hierarchical system, so it is very congregationally dependent. So.
Other questions?
Go ahead.
Well, I think you're first. I was just curious, and it's not about Rhode Island, but what was your family's reaction whenever you decided to become Muslim?
They're kind of freaked out, and that was just because, as I learned over the years, just because they didn't know what it meant. I think they thought it meant I was going to move to Egypt and just be like, all right, Mom and Dad, come visit me in Cairo, And although I was interested in things like that, that wasn't sort of my modus operandi. And then, they were just worried that it meant some sort of what one scholar terms cultural apostasy, right? That I wouldn't dress the way I dress. I'm dressed the way I grew up, except I got these cool Islamic cufflinks made by my friend in the United Arab Emirates. So that's my little touch, my little geometric design. So, they felt that I might walk around with a turban and a thobe, which is like the one-piece tunic, and I definitely have done that in my time. But I think that as I struggled to figure myself out as a Muslim, because Islam was so insistent on one's the rights of one's parents and love for one's parents regardless of their religion, it actually improved our relationship. So I remember my mom, about 6 months after I converted, was kind of giving me the business, and I just stopped her. I said, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I just want to ask you a question. Do you think I'm a better son now that I became Muslim than I was before? And she was like, yeah, you are. You got me there. So I think that in that respect, it brought us closer. And then, in terms of my marriage, my wife is Muslim. Her parents were originally from Bombay, and then settled in Chicago, and that's where she was born. My wife and her family really fit well with my family, and they really see eye to eye on a lot of things. And partially that has to do with that my father is a Harvard MBA, my mother's a Chicago MBA, and Sumaya's brothers are either Harvard or Chicago MBAs, and she's a Harvard MBA. So I'm the only non-MBA in the family, and I think they're worried about how I'm going to provide income long term. But otherwise, they really do see eye to eye, and the cultural distance is not that great. And so, it's a very positive relationship now. But of course, they still think things are weird. Every time Ramadan comes around, I can't believe you fast, from sunup to sundown. That's so. Why does God want you to do that? I didn't decide it. That's just what He wants. So I do it. But otherwise, yeah. I mean, it was a process of learning for them. So.
I'm from the Midwest as well, so I kind of know the type of people that are there. So I was curious about what it was like for you. So good.
Yeah, I mean, I remember once my dad was he's like, we have friends that are Jewish. I can understand if you want to be Jewish, but Muslim. He's like, we don't know anybody who's Muslim. And it was it's for me, and this is a part of the American experience, especially for white kids, is that there's a changing nature of your experience growing up, right? So especially in terms of race and diversity and ethnicity, right? So my experience was radically different than my parents, and theirs was radically different than their parents. So that's part of the American story too, because becoming Muslim in America is also a whole sort of racial experience too, especially if you're white. So, but that's a whole nother lecture. You had a question?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of teachers from whatever era, so I was wondering if you could talk more about, was it Imam Nawawi from Damascus, and what resonates about his interpretations for you?
I'll try to cut me off if I start going too long. So in the Quran, right, the first chapter is called Surah Al-Fatiha, and in every cycle of the daily prayer, which is at least 17 times a day, the Muslim prays, "Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim." Guide us on the straight path, the path of those upon whom you have showed your blessings, or upon whom you have shown your favor. And what this always makes me think about is that in Islam, there's the prophets who are the main, carriers of the message from God. But then there's the question of who carries the message after the prophets. And there's many different answers to this in the broader Islamic tradition, but the tradition that I hold to is essentially encapsulated in a hadith of the Prophet, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and peace and blessings be upon him. Al-ulama warathatul anbiya, that the scholars or the knowledgeable people are the inheritors of the prophets. That the inheritance of the prophets is their knowledge that they pass on to their community, which is then embodied in people of great character and righteousness. So as I studied Islam, I had this big question of who in the tradition do I identify with? Who do I feel a sense of solidarity with? When I look at the Christian tradition, for example, I feel a great sense of solidarity with St. Augustine. His life story, his works resonate with me a lot. But obviously as a Muslim, that question is even more palpable about who resonates with me in the Islamic tradition. And so there are a number of people, that I could speak about. And since you asked about Imam Nawawi, about him, is that Imam Nawawi was someone who lived a very short time. He was in his 40s when he passed away. But the books that he produced have remained standard references for Muslims for 800 years afterwards. Because he was so dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge that he produced an enormous corpus of works that it's almost miraculous. If you actually understood how much he produced in the way of sophisticated intellectual production in his short lifetime, it's a sort of unfathomable how someone could do that. And the stories about him is that he was just so dedicated to his knowledge, but he was also so dedicated to living according to the knowledge that he knew. So much so that he was a master of one of the schools of law, the Shafi'i school. And in all of the schools of law, there's a concern about, what are lawful transactions and the nature of injustice when someone, usurps someone's rights, right? And in the Islamic tradition, there's a long history of the rulers of different countries usurping the rights of people or institutions by taking their land or taking their endowments or whatever it may be, and using that income for themselves and using that land for themselves, and perhaps then selling it to win, favor with one of their generals, whatever it may be. So obviously Damascus, which is where Imam Nawawi did his studying, was a place that had seen many, many Muslim rulers over many centuries by the time he arrived on the scene. And even though he lived in Damascus, he would not eat the food that was grown within the vicinity of Damascus because he was worried that the food that had been grown on land that had been unjustly taken from somebody and then given to somebody else. And he was worried that that would affect his spiritual state. So he was the sort of first localvore, so he would only eat the produce from his hometown of Nawa, which is south of Damascus, where I visited. It was more of a rural place. He could be sure that the people there were tending the animals properly, that were growing things on plots of lands that had belonged to their family for generations. And so even though his daily schedule was one that's, again, mind-boggling in terms of he had, basically he was either in worship or studying or teaching or writing. That's all he did. He never got married. In Islam, it's preferred for people to get married, but it's not required. And there's a whole tradition of scholars that are so devoted to their scholarship that they never get married. So he never got married, and his life was his books. But he was someone that lived those books, It was not just a theoretical discourse. And so he's someone that is universally recognized by Sunni Muslims, because he was a Sunni very clearly, as, you know, essentially, you know, a very, very righteous person and one of the greatest scholars. And literally, like, if you're studying the Shafi'i school of law, you know, probably the first text that you'll study, even to this day in Indonesia, is Imam an-Nawawi's text. You know, is his primer in that particular legal school. If you're studying the hadith literature, the sayings of the Prophet, his collection of 42 hadiths of the Prophet is the standard introductory text that people say, you know, this is the text that you should read if you want to understand Islam sort of on its most basic and comprehensive level. You know, a text that is widely read even in the United States. And there was even an American Muslim scholar who wrote a whole commentary, a 3-volume commentary on that collection of 42 sayings. So Imam an-Nawawi is someone who represents that sort of pinnacle of scholarship and pinnacle of piety that I think, you know, every Muslim wants to emulate on some level. And they know that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is the ultimate source of emulation, but they also look for people in the tradition that, you know, emulate something. They have inherited something special from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And Sunni Muslims generally look to Imam Nawawi as one of those people that is, you know, full. And there's many also more miraculous stories about his life, but you know, I'll stick with the less miraculous, but perhaps no less miraculous in its own way. So
I hate to cut it off,
it's all good.
but we have more food and more opportunity to talk to Dave. I asked Rawan to come up, and I have a little disclosure. If you hadn't picked up already, I know Dave. We've worked at Brown together, and I have to say, in response to some of the things you said about yourself, that you walk the walk all the way. And I know that rabbi you talk about who seems to work 10 times harder. You work equally hard. You both are dynamos. I spent some time at Brown. I've known Dave and for several years, and he's not only a fine, what we call a Brown Bernonian, but a fine chaplain. And in fact, you are a chaplain that I emulate and look to, and we share the same mentor, Janet Cooper Nelson. I wouldn't be able to do the work that I'm doing here without Janet and Matt, who's been, I've known many, many years, and the group of chaplains who reside at Brown. So I feel as if I'm able to now be here, but I've said again and again, if your ears weren't burning, that how much I admire you, and how thrilled I am that you're here. And we have a little something for you. Oh. Yeah. It is not a parting gift. We hope you'll come back again and again.
So on behalf of Roger Williams, the Intercultural Center, and our sponsors, and the Muslim Student Association, this is a book called Road to Mecca that has the journey of Muhammad Asad, who is also a Muslim convert, who just describes his journey throughout the Hajj.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Jazakallah khairan.
And
it's very, very kind of you. It's a very pretty book too.
It is. And from me and the Spiritual Life program here at Roger Williams, I wanted from me as a Protestant, I wanted to give you this book about a wonderful Protestant, Roger Williams, and this is the latest biography on him.
Nice,
and we wanted you to have that and know the depths and the breadth to which he fought for his own beliefs and the right for others to worship as they please. So,
thank you so much.
Thank you.